If you're currently waking up early to go train and you're training fasted, you're probably limiting your muscle growth. Soon to be, Dr. Maya Wolf here from Wolf Coaching. Let's cut to the chase. Is training fasted limiting your muscle growth? Short answer, potentially. The long answer, let's get into some theory before we go there. Long story short, carbohydrates are used in a variety of ways. First, they're specifically your body's favorite form of fuel. So carbohydrates are stored in your muscles and in your liver as glycogen. That then forms fuel for your activities. Specifically, in the context of lifting, glycogen is a key source of fuel. Your body also keeps some carbohydrates around at all times in your blood. This is called blood glucose. You perform best when you have the most fuel around. In other words, if you don't have sufficient carbohydrate around, whether that's as glycogen or as blood glucose, you likely won't be performing your best. And if you're not performing your best, in all likelihood, you won't be giving yourself the best stimulus for muscle hypertrophy. Therefore, if fasting reduces how much glycogen you have around or how much blood glucose you have available, there's a chance that not eating before you train or being fasted going into training will reduce how much muscle growth you see from a given session. So that's the theory, broadly speaking. That's all well and good, but does any of this actually pan out? A recent paper from 2022 by King and colleagues tried to determine exactly what is going on here. Specifically, they tried to determine the impact of pre-exercise acute carbohydrate feedings compared to, say, a water or placebo feeding on lifting performance. They performed what's known as a meta-analysis. In a meta-analysis, you take all the studies on a given topic and you combine them in order to get one final result that is essentially an average, a weighted average of the results from all the existing studies on that topic to arrive at a more confident and a more precise estimate of how much of an effect does, for example, in this case, carbohydrate feeding have on lifting performance. The way lifting performance was assessed was via volume load. Let me give you a quick primer on what volume load really is. Volume load is simply defined as sets times reps times weight for a given exercise. Let's say you benched 100 kilograms for 3 sets of 10. That would be 100 times 3 times 10 is 3,000. Now the question with carbohydrate feeding before a training session is whether or not it increases your volume load in a given training session when training to failure. In other words, across, say, a session of 10 sets total, are you able to perform more reps at a given weight? So as opposed to a measurement of maximum strength, like say a 1 rep max, this is more of a measurement of overall muscle endurance. Importantly, some literature links volume load with hypertrophy. In other words, how much volume you're able to perform during a given session likely plays a role in how much stimulus for hypertrophy you get, and thus how much muscle you grow from a given session. So theoretically, if you're able to get a greater volume load in a given session by having some carbohydrates before training, that would then enable you to get more muscle growth from that session. So what did they find? Well, it looks like having some carbohydrates before training, as opposed to either having water or just having a placebo meal, seems to enhance performance in terms of volume load. So on average, there was an effect size of about 0.4 in favor of the carbohydrate feeding group relative to the placebo or control group. Interestingly, blood lactate, a proxy for, amongst other things, fatigue, also seemed higher when participants in these studies consumed carbohydrates before training as opposed to training fasted. The effect of pre-exercise carbohydrate intake on volume load performance was only significant when the fast preceding that meal lasted more than 8 hours. When the fasting period was lower than 8 hours, there was no effect of having carbohydrates before training session on volume load performance. That said, it wasn't so much that the effect was lower when the fasting window lasted less than 8 hours. It was more so the fact that in these studies, there was greater variance in the studies that had fasting windows of under 8 hours, and thus the effect as estimate was less precise and wasn't significant. Interestingly, when they performed something called a subgroup analysis, what they saw was that the effect of carbohydrate feeding before training was more pronounced when the session included higher volumes, so a higher number of sets per session. The same was true when comparing shorter duration, under 45 minutes, and longer duration, over 45-minute sessions. The effect of carbohydrate feeding on performance was greater when the session lasted at least 45 minutes. Here's the interesting thing though, there was no clear effect of how much carbohydrate you consumed on performance. In other words, the authors were unable to tell this carbohydrate amount was optimal for inducing performance improvements within that session. And this leads us to an interesting question. Why does having carbohydrate before a session seem to enhance volume load performance? Well, it could be a variety of things. One of them is that as you train, your muscle glycogen stores get depleted and eventually get so low that your performance can be impeded. In other words, by training consistently, you're using up fuel within your muscles, the glycogen, and having carbohydrates before or during the training session can enable you to keep that elevated as well as blood glucose, which then can help provide more fuel that goes towards your performance and improves your performance. Another new line of research suggests that actually part of the effect may just be hunger mediated. In other words, people who train after fasting typically can find that they're a bit hungry and that can interfere with performance. Whereas on the other hand, when they're not hungry, that doesn't interfere with performance. In fact, one study from 2020 showed that having a placebo meal with nothing as far as calories or carbohydrates went resulted in the same performance enhancement as having a similarly sized and textured meal that contained carbohydrates. Part of the effect here may just be from having something in your stomach that keeps you from being hungry during the session. So to summarize, it's likely a combination of two things. One is making sure that you're not hungry going into a session. So by having some carbohydrates or any other nutrient before a session, you're making sure that you're not hungry going into a session, which seemingly can decrease performance. The second thing is related to carbohydrate itself, which is that when you've been fasting for a long time, say 8 hours or more, your muscle glycogen, one of your body's preferred sources of fuel, will drop steadily. And so if you're going into a training session with suboptimal levels of muscle glycogen, that can then impede performance, which then feasibly could lead to worse muscle growth. Having carbohydrates before a training session may kind of be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you get a greater performance, greater volume load, but on the other hand, that greater volume load, while it might result in more stimulus, also results in more fatigue. And so the trade-off between stimulus and fatigue resulting from pre-exercise carbohydrate feeding needs to be considered carefully before you go ahead and have carbohydrates before every single session. The beneficial effect of carbohydrates before training also seems to be more consistent and more pronounced for lower body sessions rather than upper body sessions. Because the upper body training doesn't burn as much energy, the benefit of carbohydrate before a training session isn't as great. So when you're having a session that is very energy demanding, like think high volume lower body, that's where the additional carbohydrate before a session might be especially beneficial. So what are some practical takeaways? I would generally recommend against training fasted. If you can, right before your session, have at least a little bit of carbohydrate. It doesn't matter how much you have. In fact, it looks like even just having 10-20 grams, like a piece of fruit oftentimes, could be sufficient to get the benefits of pre-exercise carbohydrate feeding. You don't want to go into a session being hungry. That's another thing. It looks like being hungry generally impedes performance. One other practical takeaway I would give is that you don't want to be nauseated going into a session. So if you're going into a session just having had a huge meal and that leads to you feeling quite nauseated during the training session and leads to you stopping sets before you actually reach failure because you just feel nauseated and like you're about to throw up, that's probably not great. Generally have your meal about 30 minutes to 90 minutes before your training session, and generally try to make sure that you get a good amount of carbohydrate, especially before lower body sessions, higher volume sessions, and sessions that generally just take longer. That's the video. If you liked the video, please comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in that next one. Peace. Life hack, front over bicep. If it still fits into the frame, you're not big enough.